Welcome back. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about the third installment for calculating or estimating growth. And we're going to talk about the expenditure approach for estimating GDP. And then we'll also talk a couple of there's a final goods versus a value added or intermediate good approach. And then there's an income approach that we'll touch on briefly, but we're going to spend most of this segment talking about the expenditure function. And one way to calculate GDP, and they give you this neat little formula in the text, and it says GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus net exports. And it's fairly straightforward, mathematical. It's not the formula itself is not that complicated. It's how you get to those factors in that formula that gets complicated. So the first one we're talking about C, they're talking about personal consumption. And it's goods and services consumed and purchased, by household. And if you think about it, you're going to the grocery store, buying clothes, you're buying food, you're buying appliances in your home, you're paying for, maybe you've got a landscape service, so you're paying them to do your gardening, your outside work, or maybe you just have a lawn that needs mowing and you're paying the high school individual down the street to come out and mow your yard, I don't know, a weekly or every other week. Maybe you have a swimming pool and you've got somebody with the swimming pool to come in and work your swimming pool. But that's kind of what we're talking about here. And so it's anything that's consumed. And pardon, I forgot to turn my cell phone off, so it did ring, but it's basically anything that's consumed by a household. And while it seems like it might not be that big a deal in the grand scheme of things, if you stop and think about it, in your household, the consumption by the household makes up on any given year somewhere between 65 and 70% of GDP. So that is a huge component of calculating GDP. And it's been fairly stable year over year. However, there were issues with it, and they call it the depression of the recession of 2007. So 2007, 2009, there was a recession. And then they'll be talking about the COVID recession. So in 2020 was when there was a big impact on it. So you can see that. And I think the book that was written in 2021 or updated in 2021 talked about it being about 68% of the GDP. And if there are these big hits to it, you can see how it can definitely impact the calculation of the estimation of GDP by any given country, not just the United States, but other countries around the world. And then the next one that they talk about, and that's the I in the formula, that is private investment. It's worth about, in any given year, about 17, 18% of the GDP calculation. And it's all goods and services produced for use in the production of other goods and services. So it's not intermediate goods and services. It's goods that are produced to generate other production or other goods through the production process. And normally we think about that. They talk about 4 different types of investment. And the one that I think most people talk about is your fixed investment. So I'll go back to the Meharry example, and the hospital is buying any given year or maybe any given time period, they're buying maybe beds, they're buying computers, they're buying radiology equipment, they're buying laboratory equipment, they're buying surgical equipment, they may be buying robotic equipment to improve the outcomes of a surgical procedure, laparoscopic equipment. So they are buying fixed capital or physical capital. They're improving that capital stock, and that's what is considered really fixed investment. Then you've got inventory investment, and inventory investment, and we'll go back to Meharry. They may in December of 2022 have bought a lot of consumables that they were going to use to treat patients in the hospital, maybe buying consumables for the operation suites or the operational wards, or buying the disposable equipment that they use in the lab of radiology. So that's what's considered investment or inventory investment. And I think the book also talks about Levi's, where they produce Levi's in December of a year, and it goes to a clothing retailer, and that becomes inventory investment for them. And then we talk about, or at least the book talks about, residential fixed investments. And mostly they're talking about new homes. So that's when you go out, you buy a new home, and it's considered a residential investment because it's going to provide well-being for maybe you and your family, or well-being as society as a whole, and improve the welfare of society whole by providing shelter. And shelter is considered a necessity in an economic framework. And then lastly, we're talking about intellectual properties or intellectual property investment. And there you're talking about research, you're talking about books people write, you're talking about software packages. So that is all rolls up into production and consumption of private investment. And then you plug along, and the next one's G, and it's only worth, almost like private investment, it only contributes about 17% to GDP. And most people say, you're out of your mind that it's only 17%. Think of the billions of dollars a year that the government, depending on how you look at it, either spends or wastes, but at least it's money going out the door for something. And that's where, when you're talking about GDP and you're talking about the G in the formula, don't get government purchases confused with government spending, because they're not the same. Government purchases are the sum of purchases from firms that the government's buying. Say it's warships, it's airplanes, it's those types of purchases from entities that are producing them. And there are also some output that the government produces itself. But when we talk about government spending, it's not the same as government purchases, because you've got this thing that economists and society in general, and especially welfare economics and policymakers, talk about transfer payments. And transfer payments make up about 50% of government spending. It's by far the biggest category of government spending in and of itself. And you're talking about subsidies to low-income families. You're talking about maybe, in money going out the door for Medicaid or Medicare, or it's the transfer of payments. And that is a huge piece of government spending. So don't get government purchases and government spending confused. And what most people track, and well, I can't say most people, but a lot of economists and financial analysts track, is what's going on with government spending. Because one, it increases the debt, because most countries may not have the financial wherewithal or the financial capability to pay cash for everything. And secondly, government purchases can be used as a tool to fight economic downturns. So government purchases are extremely important in the calculation of GDP, but only really worth about 17%. And then lastly, we come to net exports, and net exports worth about 13% in the calculation of GDP. And basically an export is anything that's produced in the United States and sold to a foreign country, sold to a country outside of the boundaries of the United States. Something we produce here, it sells to Canada. Something we produce sells to Mexico, sells to a country in Africa, France. A lot of production in the United States goes out the door as exports. So they are calculating that in GDP. And then the flip side of that is the imports. And an import is a good or service that is purchased by somebody in the United States and consumed here in the United States. So they take exports minus imports, and they end up with net exports. So basically what you end up with, for the most part, is at least year over year, we are typically importing more than we're exporting, at least here in the United States. So we talk about, running a trade deficit. So if your exports are less than your imports, it's a trade deficit. If your exports are greater than your imports, it's a trade surplus. The book talks about neither one. It's not really, is it good or bad to be a net exporter with a trade surplus, or a net importer with a trade deficit. So I think they're more concerned from an economic view, and from GDP, they're more concerned with the well-being of the population, the well-being of the society within the United States, because again, that's what GDP, that is the rationale for calculating and estimating GDP, is try to get a handle on what is the welfare or the satisfaction or the benefits received by the individuals within the boundaries of the United States. And at this point, we're going to kind of jump in and just quickly talk about, there are two other ways that you can calculate, at least in this little subsection of chapter 5, that you can calculate GDP. One is kind of a value-added process, and they talk about value-added in the textbook. That they talk about a logger goes out and cuts down trees, takes the logs, sells it to a sawmill or a finishing mill. The finishing mill takes and turns those logs into lumber. The finishing mill turns around and ships it to a particular retailer, or they may ship it directly to a contractor or a company that specializes in building homes. And then the company or the contractor that builds a home turns around and sells that new home to an individual. And again, selling that new home goes back up to private investment, where we're talking about the residential fixed investment. So you can look at it that way and calculate it. Most times Commerce just goes in with the BEA and just calculates it using using the expenditure approach. And then finally, they talk about the income approach, which is similar to the expenditure approach, because you've got buyers and sellers meeting. You've got, I think they talk about muffins again. So you've got the seller that's producing the muffin, and the seller goes in and, they've got the ingredients, they've got the rent they pay for the bakery, or maybe the rent they pay for the storefront where they sell the muffins. And then they're paying the baker to come in and make the muffins, or maybe they're making it themselves, and they end up with profit. So you've got on the buyer side, I take out of my pocket and I pay $3 for the muffin. On the kind of the income approach on the seller side, they've got $3 for the muffin, and by the time they take out, the intermediate goods that they use to make the muffin, the rent for the building, paying the wages, and then what's left out of that $3, and hopefully there's some left out of that $3, goes to profit. So kind of on the income approach, you're looking at wages, you're looking at rents, and you're looking at profits. And then they kind of throw this acronym out in the book, and it's a lot of the data that you end up with, that are used in calculating GDP or estimating GDP comes from Fred. And, you're sitting there thinking, well, who's Fred? And it's the Federal Reserve economic data. So Federal Reserve's providing a lot of the data. BEA takes it, transforms it into GDP, and we're often running on the month after the quarter ended with our new estimate of GDP. And then, as we talked about earlier, it's updated multiple times. Once the month after the quarter ends, then the next month its estimates updated again, and then the next month it's updated again. And then, just for good measure, Commerce is going to come in usually in the summer, and they may go back and make revisions or updates for several years in the past, trying to ensure that their estimate of GDP is as close to possible or as accurate as possible. That's going to wrap it up For this section of chapter 5, we're going to jump in kind of the next section, and we're going to talk about economic growth, some business cycles, trying to start to pull together how to kind of improve GDP, or what some opportunities are to improve GDP. So we'll see everybody in a few minutes. Thank you.